and welcome back to another edition of the Venture More Sports Podcast. I'm Raffi, as always. Today, I wanted to take some time and give my Western Conference predictions for this upcoming NHL season. Most teams kick off their seasons over the next couple of days, and with that, I want to take some time and discuss the Western Conference, where I think each team will stand, and my overall standing predictions for the Western Conference. You can find the Eastern Conference video as well on our channel, so just hop into our past videos. I'm sure you guys can find it. It's likely going to be posted at around the same time. And be sure to let me know in the comments below what you think of my predictions. Be sure to like this video, subscribe as well. We also did a feature episode where we interviewed former NHLer Christoph Oliwa. So if you'd like to hear what his thoughts are for just in general about how he got to the NHL and his overall playing career, definitely check out that video as well. Moving into the Western Conference, I personally think is a little worse than the Eastern Conference, and it's kind of been like that the past couple of years. But overall, I think there's definitely some teams that I wouldn't be shocked if they wind up hoisting the Stanley Cup once the season's over in June. We'll first start off with the Pacific Division, and we'll start off just with my overall standings for the Pacific, where I have every team standing. And like I did with the East, we'll start off at the bottom. Starting off with the San Jose Sharks in 8th. Will Smith, Macklin Celebrini. I'm very excited to see both these two players play in the NHL and finally show everyone what they are capable of. Celebrini is certainly a Calder finalist. He has that potential to be one. And Will Smith, I wouldn't be shocked if he's trailing right behind him in Calder voting and scoring for this team. Even though I say that the Sharks are not a good team this year, I still expect them to be a bottom 3 team, if not one of the worst teams in the NHL. But then again, the Sharks aren't expected to be any better than a bottom 5 team. So I don't think that would be too terrible for Sharks fans to pick up another high-end top pick, maybe even James Hagan, who is currently at the University of Boston, or BU per se, Boston University. Moving into 7th, I have the Calgary Flames. The Flames, after years of me telling them to do this, they have finally decided to enter a retool-rebuild, and I think this is a big step for them. They traded Lindholm and Zadorov last year. They traded Markstrom this past offseason. And I think they're finally starting to tear the team down a little bit. We'll see what happens with a guy like Nazem Kadri if they wind up deciding to trade him at some point this year. You're not going to trade Jonathan Huberdeau because of his contract and how he's been producing the past 2 years. But regardless, I don't think the Flames are going to be a team contending for a playoff spot this year. And I think that they're just going to keep getting worse and worse into becoming a bottom 5 team. If not this year, then certainly next year. Moving into the team I have in 6th, I have the Anaheim Ducks. I expect the Ducks to have a much better year than they did this past year. And they might still likely be a bottom 10 team, but I expect them to take a big leap points-wise. So a 15 to 20 point swing puts them in the 70-point range. That's where I have the Ducks, and which would be a massive improvement from this past year. And I expect all their young pieces. You have McTavish. You have Zegras, who had a down year last year, got injured. I expect him to have a bounce back year. Leo Carlsson, I expect him to have a big year. So there's a lot of pieces that make me feel confident that the Ducks can make that sizable of a jump. And again, I don't expect them to make the playoffs this year, but I do expect them to make a positive jump in the right direction. We'll see what happens with John Gibson if he can regain his form. That's kind of like the chicken or egg debate. Is John Gibson bad or are the Ducks bad? That's kind of the question everyone has been asking for the past couple of years. But for the Ducks, I have them in 6th place. I wouldn't be shocked if they take a New Jersey Devils type of jump, as we saw 2 years ago, where all of a sudden they were a top 3 team in their division. But I'd like to temper my expectations a little bit. But I do expect the young guys to really bring this team up from the 59 points that they had last year. In 5th place, I have Seattle. Montour and Stevenson, although long-term, I don't think are great signings, especially at the price that they were signed for. I think for the media now, these are two good signings for the Seattle Kraken, who certainly had a down year last year after making the playoffs for the first time in franchise history. Wright and Beniers are going to be the two guys I really keep my eye on this year. I'd like to see Wright cement himself and play 82 games this year and take that next step into being a top 6 center in the future. And Matty Beniers got paid a 7x7 essentially this past offseason. And although he did have a sophomore slump, I expect him to have a really good year this year. So those are 2 young guys to keep an eye on in Seattle. Goaltending, that's going to be the big question, the big reason why I don't have them making the playoffs. Joey Daccord had a really good year last year, a breakout year. We'll see if he can replicate that this year, and then Grubauer hasn't lived up to his contract. So I'd have to see something positive from the goaltending before I feel comfortable saying the Seattle Kraken are a playoff team this year. Moving into fourth place, I have the LA Kings, and I actually have the LA Kings missing the playoffs this year. And overall, I didn't really know how I felt about the Kings. I made the script a week or two ago, a couple weeks ago, actually, and I didn't really know where I wanted to put them. And then Drew Doughty got hurt, and Drew Doughty is expected to miss 3-4 months. And this is something where the Kings getting off to a slow start could really, really derail their entire season. They don't have Matt Waugh anymore on the back end as well, so the decor is completely just washed. We'll see if Brand Clark can step in and be that guy who can contribute on the power play one unit and see if he can play up to a number one defenseman and hold it down in the meantime while Doughty is recovering. But between that and then the goaltending, I'm just not a big fan of the goaltending. They have the offense. I like their forward core a lot. I think that they have some solid pieces that are going to continue to develop. Quentin Byfield being one of those guys who recently signed a contract this past offseason for a couple of years. And yeah, I just have the Kings missing playoffs this year. They've gone 3 straight years of losing the first round to the Oilers. And this year, I don't think they improved in comparison to last year. So I actually have them missing the playoffs this year. I think there's other teams that I'll discuss shortly in the Central Division that will have a better chance of making the playoffs over the LA Kings. And third place, I have the Vegas Golden Knights. Yes, they lost Jonathan Marchessault, and then, as I mentioned previously, Stevenson went from the Knights to the Seattle Kraken. But I like their trade deadline pickup of Hurdle. Obviously, what they had in mind was, okay, we're going to replace Marchessault's production with a guy like Hurdle who can play top six center and be a good contributor. And they have solid defense all around. White Cloud is always underrated. Brady McNabb, another underrated defenseman. And then obviously, if you have your Pietrangelo, you also have my boy Nick Hague, and then Shea Theodore, who could forget him. So I think the Vegas Golden Knights, I expect them to be the third best team in the Pacific this year. I expect them to have another solid year. And once again, the Pacific isn't a really good division this year. So I really think that Vegas just gets third just for being third, being better than the rest of them. So I have Vegas in third. And as long as their goaltending, Aiden Hill has a solid year again, I wouldn't be shocked if the Golden Knights even potentially are the second best team in the Pacific this year. Moving into my top two, at number 2, I have the Vancouver Canucks. I was very surprised by how well they played last year. They got off to an amazing start, and everyone, including myself, expected them to come back down to earth. That did not happen at all. They played very consistently and were a game away from potentially making the Western Conference final. So this Vancouver Canucks team, yeah, they lost Nikita Zadorov. Elias Lindholm, they lost in free agency, but I don't think he was good enough or really meshed well with the Canucks to where I feel like losing him was a big loss for them. But you bring in Jake DeBrusk from the Boston Bruins, I think that's going to be a solid piece of their top 6. And overall, I think the Canucks are certainly going to be one of the top teams in the Pacific this year. The big question for me, Dakota Joshua and Thatcher Demko are going to be likely missing about a month. So if the Canucks can hold it down for that first month of the season until Demko returns, then I think the Canucks will certainly be well equipped to make the playoffs this upcoming year. And then lastly, in first place, the Stanley Cup runner-up, the Edmonton Oilers. The Oilers were a team that were one game away, as mentioned previously. They lost Broberg and Holloway to offer sheets, although I don't think Broberg played well in the playoff run last year, but he didn't play great entirely last year to where I feel like losing him is a big loss. Dylan Holloway could potentially develop into a solid top 9 third liner, but I don't think they're missing too much with him. But you bring in Skinner, you bring in Arvidsson, you bring in Matthias Janmark. I really like the Buffalo Sabres forward group. And Jeff Skinner, I think, is an extremely underrated player this year. If you put him alongside Leon Draisaitl or Connor McDavid, I wouldn't be shocked if he puts up 30 goals. He was just one season removed of having 72 points with the Buffalo Sabres. So I wouldn't be shocked if the Oilers are, no pun intended, a well-oiled machine this year. I think they are, if not the best team, the second best team in the Western Conference. And as long as Stuart Skinner has another solid year, I think the Oilers are going to make a lot of noise. And getting off to a good start this year, unlike last year, is just going to make them even better. And they'll be contending for sure for a President's Trophy. So we'll see what happens. But this is how I have the Pacific Division shaking out. And then now we'll move over to the Central Division. Moving over to the Central Division, as you can see here in my Central Division standings predictions. In 8th place, I have my Chicago Blackhawks, and although I do have them finishing last, I think they're going to take a massive jump point-wise this year to where they're going to be in that low-end 70 points, high-end 80-point range, maybe even a little better than that. And there's so many factors that went into that prediction, that large and drastic of a point prediction. One of them being Connor Bedard, generational player. We've seen it before with Sidney Crosby, Connor McDavid, and etc., other generational players really take that leap from their first year to their second year. I expect that similar leap to happen with Connor Bedard, to where he's a point per game, if not better, player this year. And again, the offseason additions are just going to help him even more and help round out this team. They finally have an NHL roster. I like their top 6 additions that they made: Teravainen and Bertuzzi. You also have Taylor Hall returning. He played barely 10 games last year after tearing his ACL. And then you also have Ilya Mikheyev, who's an underrated player as well for that third line, in my personal opinion, of where I think he would slot in. And then you also bring in Martinez and Brody on the blue line. Brossois is much, much more improved in the backup position as Arvid Soderblom last year. And again, I don't expect the playoffs for the Blackhawks. I don't expect them to be competing for a wild card spot, but I do expect them to take a sizable leap points wise, even though they'll finish likely 8th in the Central Division. Moving into 7th, I have the Minnesota Wild. The Wild are still capture up from the Parise and Suter buyouts, and I think teams like Utah and St. Louis, who were able to improve their roster in the offseason, have passed Minnesota. The big question for them is Fleury and Gustafsson, who both had down years last year. It'll be interesting to see if they can bounce back. That'll help Minnesota, but again, I just don't think that they're well-rounded enough to make the playoffs. I think as a whole, they kind of cap out as maybe an 80, 85 point team. I don't expect them to be any better than that. Moving to 6th, I have Utah, the Utah Hockey Club. This is their first year in Utah, their inaugural season. I think a big thing for them is now you have stable ownership. Ownership wants to win. You have a stable city. You know you're going to be in Utah. And I think that's really going to help the players this year play really well. Clayton Keller obviously is now the captain, as announced a couple days ago. I think that was probably the best choice that they could have gone with. And they also picked up some nice splashes on the back end, too, with Sergachev and Marino to really bolster that top 4. I expect the Utah Hockey Club to make a nice jump, 10 to 15 points, and competing with St. Louis and LA for that second wildcard spot. I decided to go with the Blues here, but I wouldn't be shocked if Utah surprises me even more than I currently have them predicted as. Now moving into the teams that I have in the wildcard spots, the Jets and the Blues. The Blues, Broberg, if he can play up to how he was playing in the playoffs last year as a top 4 defenseman, I think that's going to be a big help for the Blues. And then Dylan Holloway can be a solid top 9 forward for them as well. The big question for me personally is goaltending. Can Binnington prove that he is a starting goaltender? He's had some shaky starts over the past couple years, so if he can solidify the net, then St. Louis should be on their way to making the playoffs, along with that back end as well, which has had questions in the past. Jordan Kyrou and Robert Thomas, I expect big years out of them, and I all around feel better about the Blues than I do with Utah, so that's why I have the Blues in that wildcard 2 spot. Now in the wildcard 1 spot, the Winnipeg Jets, who haven't really done much over the past couple of years since making it to the Western Conference Final in 2018, losing to the Vegas Golden Knights. The big question, can they get over the hump? I don't think so. I think they've been passed by the Nashville Predators, as evident by my standing predictions, as you can see right next to me. And Connor Hellebuyck, Ehlers, Connor, Morrissey, they have the pieces to where I feel confident that they'll make the playoffs, but the defensive depth isn't as good as I'd like to see. You lose Laurent Brossois, even though that's not going to really matter too much in the playoffs, as long as Hellebuyck stays healthy. And I like the forward core, but again, I just think that there's better teams in this division and better teams in the league before I'd say that Winnipeg is a top 10 team or a for sure locked to be a top 3 team in the Central Division this year. They've certainly proven me wrong in the past, but for now, I have Winnipeg as the 4th best team in the Central and my wildcard 1. Now moving into my top 3. Third, I have Nashville. Nashville made some big splashes this offseason, picking up Stamkos, Marchessault, and Brady Shea. Now, Marchessault and Stamkos are certainly up there in the mid-30s, but for the immediate now, I think these are 2 great additions that they made to their top 6. Brady Shea is an excellent addition for their top pair as well, especially after they traded Mattias Ekholm a year or 2 ago to the Edmonton Oilers. And Shea doesn't really bring what Mattias Ekholm brought to the Nashville Predators, but regardless, Brady Shea is a top pair defenseman similar to him. I expect the Predators to be a top 3 team this year. They could potentially slide into number 2 as well, depending on some of the questions with Colorado that I'll get into shortly. But yeah, I think the Predators are for sure top 3 team this year in the Central Division, and I think they're certainly very underrated and could go on a potential cup run if things work out for them. Now in second place, as I indicated 5 seconds ago, we have the Colorado Avalanche. Nichushkin and Landeskog, are they going to play? Are they going to be healthy, in a healthy mindset? And those are the big questions for me. If they are back, ready to go, in good mindsets and good health, then I think the Colorado Avalanche are for sure going to be a top 2 team in the Central and right back into being a contending team this year. But if neither of them are ready to go, or the Colorado Avalanche deal with some issues with them, plus Georgiev doesn't have a bounce back year, then they'll still make the playoffs, but I don't think they'll go on a deep run this year like they did in 2022, capturing the Stanley Cup. So we'll see what happens. Cale Makar, also expecting him to have a big year, and then Mikko Rantanen on a contract year. He's been great the past couple years, but I think there's another tier that he could potentially get to if he has a really good year this year. And then, as you can tell, the team that I haven't talked about yet and the team in first place, the Dallas Stars. I really like the Dallas Stars. I had them in the Stanley Cup final this past year rather, and then this year I wouldn't be shocked if they make it to the Stanley Cup final because they're just a solid team. I think their defense did get worse. They lost Chris Tanev in the offseason. They replaced him with Matt Dumba and some other guys who I don't really feel as confident with overall. Nils Lundqvist wasn't really a good fit for them last year, and he was a young guy that they were kind of banking on. But they have great offensive weapons as a whole. And this is without Joe Pavelski, who retired this past offseason. Logan Stankoven and Wyatt Johnson, I expect big years from them. And if they can step it up offensively, then I don't think their offense is going to miss a beat. Defensively, I think they'll be able to hold it down. Although, once again, I think that they're likely going to be looking for a top 4 defenseman come the trade deadline. And Ottinger is Ottinger. So I feel really good about the situation in net with Scott Wedgwood backing him up. But yeah, let me know what you guys think about my Central Division and Pacific Division predictions. Let me know who you guys think is too high, who's too low, and what your overall predictions are. I'd love to hear them in the comments below. And yeah, be sure to like this video, subscribe to our channel as well, and I'll talk to you guys again soon. See ya.